So I mainly work on kind of feminist politics and looking, I suppose, differently at sexual violence and how we might reduce sexual violence. So looking at the kind of cultural and social structures that underpin and enable it. And that's really where I've, focused my work in the last few years and kind of what I'll be teaching you about if you come.
I'll be teaching on intersectionality and a lot of the issues that discussed before around the interplay between state violence and interpersonal violence. And wider than that, I'll be incorporating lots of examples, not just from the US, but more expanded than that of intersectional feminist theory, from Claudia Jones, who you might know from founding the Notting Hill Carnival, to the Organisation of Women in African and Asian Descent, an organisation founded in the 80s, all the way through to the Grunwald strike in West London, where Asian women withdrew their labour in the fight against sexism, racism and labour exploitation. So lots of varied examples of intersectional theory and thought from the US, but also from here in the UK and Europe more broadly.
And I teach one of the core modules on the stream and the pathway, which is Gender, Sexuality and Criminal Justice. And in that course, we basically ask, why haven't we made more progress around reducing interpersonal and sexual violence, and how might we think about those problems differently? And I also do research I'm interested in questions of gender and sexuality and imprisonment, both how gender and sexuality shape and influence the way in which the prison is run and structured and institutionalized. But I'm also interested in questions around our kind of punitive investments culturally outside of the prison and more broadly, why, how kind of punitive cultures get manifest through sexual and gender politics.
Yeah, I guess what's quite interesting about Birkbeck's approach to understanding these issues is that it's quite expansive in understanding issues around race and class and gender and disability, and how they intersect with at the individual level, but also at the state level. So I think what's interesting about Birkbeck's approach is that it brings all of these different facets into the analysis, which can be quite unusual in a lot of other places. So, I mean, an example of that, when we're thinking about how anti-violence research can intersect with looking at between state and interpersonal violence, we can look at examples like immigration requirements that make migrant women dependent on their husbands, which exacerbate power differentials, with some men actually weaponizing the threat of deportation as a form of control in and of itself. And with the hostile environment in immigration, that has meant that perpetrators' threat to have their partners deported is actually being actualized by the state. So we've got 50% of police forces in the UK having a policy of arresting domestic or sexual violence survivors if they're known to be undocumented. And examples like this can really help to tease out the intersections between state violence and violence at the interpersonal level, and how they reinforce each other, how they support each other, and what the experiences of that can be for those who are experiencing that kind of oppression.
I think what's connected with that is, just this expansive view, looking at the things that we don't normally look at. So, when we talk about domestic and sexual violence or the overrepresentation of men, that we're not going to stand back and say, oh, this is just about, a group of bad men, and usually who do those men happen to be? They happen to be men who are socially marginalized, excluded, but we need to look at these bigger questions. What is it about our society's ideas of masculinity? What is it about the way that our society conducts relationships and teaches people to conduct relationships and, to conduct sexual relationships that means that they're so associated with violence? And again, this hidden thing, why don't we talk about it? When we talk about crime rates, we don't include crimes that occur in the home, like domestic violence. We're talking about things that occur on the streets. And so why do we separate these things out and make something seem kind of normalized and unspoken? And I think you're right, we have to look in that expansive way to really understand it.
One of the strengths, I think, of the program is that there is a real commitment to kind of theoretically informed but empirically grounded work. So We have scholars that specialize in queer theory and feminist theory and critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and are bringing that kind of theoretical perspective to bear on very concrete, specific problems. So we also have a kind of a lot of connections with community groups and activist organizations, and there's a kind of real interest in kind of questions of social justice and how do we do our research work in a way that is trying to address the problems of violence or the problems of inequality in the criminal justice system. You know, what has been wrong with the current approach, or how could we do things differently, or how might we need to think about the problems in a completely different way in order to try and shift how we're dealing with those things.